Welcome to All Things Work, a podcast from SHRM. I'm your host, Anne Sparaco. Each week on All Things Work, we're joined by thought leaders and industry experts, and we dive into these game-changing trends that are shaping the world of work. And this week, we're discussing how compliance and workplace law connects to building a healthy workplace culture. And joining us today to talk all about this is Steve Paskoff, the founder and CEO of Elis, which, if you don't know what that is, it is Employment Learning Innovations. Steve, welcome to All Things Work.
And thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to work with your audience.
Yes, of course. So happy to have you. And we understand Elis is a training company. It's focused on helping organizations address uncivil behaviors and improve that workplace culture, right?
That's pretty close, Anne. It's a learning company, and our mission has evolved over time. So yes, we do learning, and yes, we engage learners, but we're also trying to change culture, which requires a bit more than only delivering great first-rate learning.
There's a lot to it, and there's so much we're going to discuss about that going into today's episode. And you formerly practice employment law, and you were an attorney for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey from that area of your life and how it led you to your current role at Elis?
When I was in law school, I'm from Pittsburgh, I was, during my second year and third year, an investigator for the EEOC. And I wanted to do something in civil rights. And when I graduated, I got a job with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as a trial attorney in the Atlanta office. I stayed there about a year, and I investigated and did litigation in pattern and practice and individual cases. I then got a job defending employers, advising employers, developing affirmative action programs, and ultimately doing training. Now, I also had a career in speech, in debate, and I also was in theater. And I'll just tell you, I was also a tour guide at a brewery for 2 years in college. And I enjoyed public speaking. And I started to think about how can I bring something other than just talking about the law into the workplace. Talking about people to people about the law is not what changes behavior, I learned. So eventually I developed a way of training that was different, interactive, experiential, engaging. And one night, my wife, I should also say, is an entrepreneur too, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, I want to start a company. And I went up to my wife and she said, let's do it. And we did. And I started Elis by myself with my wife, a great business advisor and support, in 1986. And it's grown since then for nearly 38 years come this November.
That's such a great achievement to have, and it's wonderful to see that you had that support starting out. That's really what it takes to start such a business that wants to create such a big impact, especially on workplace culture, because it impacts so many people, not just across our nation, but globally. Anybody can relate to if their workplace culture is positive or if it has a negative effect on their life. And it creates this domino effect on so many aspects of, a business goals, all the way from the CEO down to, the assistant or the associate in the organization. And I know that a lot of the outcome comes down to action-based models. And you use that as an approach to this subject with some companies, I understand. What are these models exactly?
Let me give you a bit of background, if I may, Anne. First thing is that what I learned is what you said is right. You have to have core behaviors because that's what people remember. The more you give people to remember, the less they will. You want to, when you do learning and when you talk about culture, focus on core behaviors that are simple, clear, and few, and I'll talk about it. Now, initially, what I was trying to do was prevent lawsuits. I remember having cases where somebody said to me, and I remember the person very clearly, he said, well, at least that leader won't do it again after he, in this case, went through litigation and cross-examination. And I remember thinking there's got to be a better way. So our first marketing expression was learn in the classroom, not in the courtroom. and that was focusing just on the law. I did have an experience I'd like to tell you about that expanded our mission, and it really got us into culture. As a lawyer, I thought the only thing you have to worry about is violating the law. Then I had an experience nearly 20 years ago that changed my worldview and what Eli is all about. I was hired to work with a group of cardiac surgeons at a hospital that I'll just call Hospital X. I won't say where, I won't identify it, but they were great cardiac surgeons technically. And technically was their strong suit. The problem was when I was asked to come up and meet them is that they had two surgeons who were great technically, but their behavior was outrageous. They would scream, they would yell, they would insult, they would demean, they would embarrass, they would shut down people on the team. They were in charge. And the problem was, or what the reality was, what they were doing was not specifically illegal. The problem was the impact it was having on the teams they work with and the risk to patient care and even survival. I remember, and anyone who knows me will remember I've told this story very briefly many, many times. I interviewed in the part of working with this organization, a lot of people, two nurses sat next to each other. I said, what's it like for working for these two doctors? One said, I feel like I'm reliving the worst day of my life every time I'm in the OR with one of these doctors. The other said, it's not a problem for me. I said, what's the secret? Simple. What is it? I told the director of surgery that if you assign me to work with these two, I will quit and join the military. I come from a military family and I would rather serve in Iraq than work with these two surgeons. I won't do it. So I don't. Then I talked to anesthesiologists, and the anesthesiologist said, and they're the same race and gender as these two male surgeons. They said, when we're in surgery, there are times that we don't speak up when we see vital signs change as quickly as we should speak up, that is. And we realize that if we speak up, it could disrupt that surgeon and that would be riskier. So we wait until we have to at times. I couldn't believe it. And I realized that the problem was really severe. And when I did research, what I found is that that type of behavior, and it's current research that's saying the same thing, can cause mortality, complications, minimize recovery results. It's not necessarily illegal what they were doing behaviorally in terms of employment laws, but think about it. That was the issue. It changed my whole view to focus not just on illegal behavior, but behavior that typically interferes with organization values like respect, what we call inclusion, civility, professionalism. And this hospital have had them for many years, posted all over the place. They just weren't applying them.
Wow. That is such an eye-opening story. I was very captivated by the fact that you're talking about somebody else's life at stake. And because of, the lack of civility, and that poor behavior, that person's life was at risk. A lot of people, when they think of, workplace behaviors, what mainly comes to mind for a lot of people, especially not in the healthcare industry, they're thinking like an office situation. And there's so many different types of workplaces that we don't even are probably not even fully aware of that exists, or we're not really sure what it looks like. And so when you put that type of situation in other industries, in other offices, in other workspaces, they have so many different types of impacts, right?
And this is even more shocking in its own way, but you're absolutely right. Several years earlier, I was doing work for a major nuclear power plant. And what I was trying to do with my colleagues was to work to change the culture so that people would speak up, because there were people who were not speaking up about potential nuclear safety hazards because of the concerns they had about how they would be received or treated.
That fear of retaliation, that is a real thing. A lot of employees and employers, people in different aspects of the workplace can really relate to, whether they truly felt it at one point or, they just thought about it. It didn't feel that extreme, but either way, it's still something you think about, especially in those situations. That's why it's so important to establish that workplace culture very clearly from the beginning. And you talked about civility, and for our audience, those who may not know, SHRM has a civility campaign, that we launched, and it's called the 1 Million Civil Conversations. We already passed that, which is good news. But a lot of questions that we've had before is, okay, what does civility look like? What does uncivil behavior look like? And that's actually very subjective. A lot of people have different perspectives on what that looks like. And, what are your thoughts on that?
In our world, the Eli world, we've been teaching and worked with thousands of people, actually about 2.5 million, teaching them what we call civil treatment. Civil treatment is our proprietary approach for the workplace, because civility is different in different contexts. What you might say in your family, with your friends, is different than the workplace. So in the workplace, what our work has evolved to do is to blend a meld of behaviors that involve that which are illegal and that which violate values of the kind that you're talking about that we would say are uncivil. Now, defining those behaviors is not all that complicated. Here's a way that we look at it. People that you work with in any organization, mine, yours, everyone, none of us are perfect. What we try to do is to eliminate the behaviors that are the most inexcusable, risky, and harmful, not just because they're illegal, but because there are certain things that I could say to you or you could say to me if we work together. And once we say them, text them, write them, or they're repeated or they're posted, we'll work together, but the trust will never easily change. I'd really want to say it won't change. And think about something that you can say, if somebody said that about me, and I'd say this to the audience too, it would never be the same. Core principle is you do not do these things, not just because they're illegal and not just because they violate our values, that both is true quite often, but because of the impact it can have at work. And what we're trying to get people to understand is when you say or do things, it's not just that we're saying it's a legal risk. It's not just that it's saying that it violates the values, but the key is that the impact it can have on teamwork, collaboration, safety, mortality, and the like is absolutely critical. Now, we're not perfect, but at least we should get people to understand that. And I will tell you, as somebody who's been in this area a long time, when you have bad cases, no one says, I didn't know you couldn't or shouldn't say that stuff. That's not the problem. But culturally, they've been allowed to do it, or it's been ignored, or it's been passed down to generation. Changing that is step one. The second step is to get people to know that they can speak up. And that means that if you and I work together, Anne, and it's not one of those over the hill things that can't be readily fixed, we want to have a culture where you can talk to me or I can talk to you. We'll listen together. And then we say, oh, I didn't realize it. Or no, I didn't really say that. We work it out and move on. However, when those behaviors continue, then it's critical that people feel safe. And even if they don't want to go speak to the other person, they feel safe going to the organization, speaking about it, and knowing one way or another, it'll be looked at, addressed, and responded to. And that requires people to come forward with clarity and specificity, not just conclusions, but actual behavioral examples that can be fixed. Now, that's a mouthful, but it's not all that complicated, except getting people to do it is.
That makes a lot of sense. It doesn't need to be this complicated. The simple steps of defining it and showing it in that role model behavior, I think, can take it very far. And we know that once these strategies are defined, there's a lot that organizations can do. So, how can organizations actually measure their success of these strategies? That's something I'm curious about, and I know a lot of people, in our audience might be curious about.
You would do basically surveys that can be anecdotal or
Mhm.
quantitative and ask certain questions and see what the change in the results would be over time, anecdotally and quantitatively. But there's a step in, if I may, that is absolutely critical, a couple. Just telling people that this is important is not good enough. It's got to be seen, the issue of civility, what we call in our world civil treatment, as operational necessity on a par with safety, productivity, collaboration, financial success, talent acquisition, retention, advancement, and the like. It is not a nicety. And just telling people it's not enough. It's got to be treated with the serious of purpose that I mentioned. For that, you have to see this as a cultural initiative. Let me ask you a question and turn the tables on you. Maybe too far in advance, but I'll ask your audience. Does anyone remember, I'll ask it rhetorically, the last time when they were flying to another destination and they flew all the time, that they ran through the airport and jumped on a plane without stopping to talk to anyone or be stopped by anyone? Most people who've traveled for a while would say, well, when I think about it, that would be September 12th of 2001, because it was after September 11th that the behavior that we as passengers were allowed to engage in changed dramatically. And it wasn't just telling people, there was an organizational commitment, there was communication, there were standards, and there were consequences. If I ran through the airport like that and I knew it was wrong and nobody liked it, but there were no consequences, a lot of people, not necessarily me, but a lot of people would keep doing it. And you've got to make it continuous and measure continuous results like you do with safety, quality, and the other areas that I mentioned.
Right. So you suggest, going back to kind of that addressing that type of behavior, kind of holding it responsible. You're talking about a lot, and a lot of HR professionals are, in this area where they wonder how do you measure that? At what point do you, recommend discipline or something else? So that's definitely something a lot of people think about as well. And I know that there's quite a balance when it comes to integrating this compliance while also trying to maintain, that business goal, because you want to have that healthy workplace culture. You also want to be successful in your organization. So what are some of those common challenges in finding that balance and making sure that you're trying to be successful in both areas?
In too many organizations, compliance and cultural behavior are separated. They need to be integrated and connected. And there's something the workplaces have that is right in front of just about every organization that can do that. You all, members of the audience, I'm going to assume, or virtually all, work in organizations that has a mission, vision, values, and standards of core behavior. They should apply across the board in terms of standards of professionalism, safe conduct for the reasons we've talked about. That should unite people, and that can minimize compliance risk and the other kinds of operational risks too. But they should be integrated. It's cost effective, it's efficient, and it gets people to remember just what they need to remember to prevent the worst and work out the rest.
Yeah, that's I like what you said about not defining it as separate things, but just bringing it together, because they do coincide. They are two different things, but they impact each other so much. So they have to work together in order to be successful, right?
Yes, and you can teach elements of the law behaviorally without acting as if you're a law professor that bores people to death and puts them to sleep. And let me say, a lot of the compliance that focus is information, and that's what it does. At the end of the day, you want to guard against the worst, let people know, and get them to speak up. If you don't know, get help. And other core principles like that, just a few, and talk things out or talk things up the organization.
So I'm going to switch gears here right now and talk a little bit about how we've seen such a polarizing year regarding our election year. And we know a lot of the topics and a lot of the events that have occurred over the last several months have led to this divisiveness among people across our nation in all areas, no matter, what perspective you might have. And we know that those conversations about these topics, about these candidates, anything involving it, it's hard to keep it out of the workplace. So some people obviously are going to not talk about it in the workplace, but not everybody is exactly the same. And we've talked about this, regarding our civility index at SHRM, where we found that there were millions of these types of conversations or uncivil acts because of these conversations happening every single day in the workplace. And that's a big number. Millions. I'm talking, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I know in everyday lives, it's 201 million acts per day of uncivil acts. How can employers foster that culture of inclusion and respect during these politically charged times like what we're experiencing right now?
And this is something I've written about, spoken about, and feel as passionately as I sense you do and the audience does as well, because it's a huge issue. The times we're living in, and this is my view, talking about political differences has its same degree of potential highly charged emotions as talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, disability, citizenship, and the like. And really, I think that organizations, and there may be some special rules for public organizations. I'll speak most readily right now to private organizations, should say a couple of different things. Number one, if you're going to talk about these issues, think about it as a talk, not a monologue. If you're not willing to listen to someone else, you have nothing to say. It's not going to be useful. Second, if you want to talk about it, you've got to avoid those kinds of behaviors that in today's world, the practical reality is they can be just as damaging as the other categories, race, sex, religion, in terms of causing permanent ruptures that don't heal. You can ask people, if you're an employer, how many times have you convinced someone of a different view when you had a spirited, dismissive, condescending, rude, or insulting conversation? Pretty close to zero is what it's going to be. The other thing is you've got to let people know it's a conversation, as I said, not a monologue. And somebody can be involved in one, but if they say, enough, I don't want any more, we stop. And if it continues, because it can affect teamwork, collaboration, focus, concentration, results, safety, everything I mentioned, we want people to say, I'm going to my manager. They don't have to say it to that person, but to know that they'll be welcome to discuss it because it's a problem with business operations. And it should be an organizational standard that not just, again, an organizational nicety.
Our own president and CEO, Johnny C. Taylor Jr., I think said it best one time in an interview that I was sitting in on. He said, diversity is our strength. And that means diversity of perspectives. And everybody has that right to feel included, even with their thoughts or their backgrounds or their perspectives. And that's why, we lead with inclusion, because it just is such an important thing to do and to lead with. And I like to try to squeeze this question in for every guest at the end of the episode, because I always find it curious, and I'm sure other people might find it curious as well. What type of advice, maybe one piece of advice that you would give yourself to land where you are in your success today?
Well, thank you for that. I would say, think of yourself in 20 or 30 years. Where do you want to be? Not just financially. What do you want to look back on as important in your life? And I feel grateful. And I've never been asked this question, Anne. it's personal, but I'll share it with your audience. When I was about in my early 30s, I remember thinking, what do I want to accomplish and look back on at the current me that helped me do it? And what I wanted to do was to have an impact beyond defending cases. And now when I look back at things, I'm grateful to that younger me because I did it. And I'm grateful to my wife because we took that risk. And I can say things can be challenging, but I can say we have affected people in the US, globally, millions with this message.
I love asking that question because I feel like it digs deeper into the human side. And you just kind of learn a little lesson for yourself too, that maybe you could tell yourself this as well, just to keep yourself going. So thank you so much, Steve, for your time. We truly enjoyed your insights and your expertise on this subject matter. And that'll do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. Before we say goodbye, I encourage you all to follow All Things Work wherever you enjoy your podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a time to comment, leave a review. And finally, you can find all of our episodes on our website. It's easy to find. It's shrm.org/allthingswork. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. Catch you next time.